title of this session is Urbanism and Sustainability. I'm Benfield. I'm Senior Counsel with Placemakers. Placemakers is a planning, coding, and urban design advisory firm working across the United States and Canada. I live in Washington, D.C., where I've lived for over 40 years. I basically went to D.C. to go to law school and never left. Washington is now my home. The other preliminary thing to say, speaking of daunting, is that following Andres at CNU is a little like following Bruce Springsteen in New Jersey. But I'm going to hope that the subject matter carries the day. Speaking of the subject matter, urbanism is potentially a vast topic, and sustainability is potentially an even bigger topic. There are so many things that we could spend our time talking about. But what I want to do is to concentrate my remarks on the environmental aspects of sustainability. I know there are other very important aspects of sustainability, but it's the environment that I'm going to address. I'm not a planner, by the way. I'm not an architect. I'm a lawyer by education and an environmental advocate by experience. And I'm going to concentrate on those forms of environmental sustainability that can be influenced by urbanism or the shape and form of our urban development. And I'm going to do that by sharing with you some big picture data. And then I want to put on the table a fundamental premise that I think affects everything else. And then I want to share with you 6 strategies by which I think urbanism can further the cause of sustainability. Or as I like to say, 6 keys to greener, healthier people habitat. So let's start with the data. In the next several decades, we're going to be having development, and a lot of it, between 2010 and 2050 in the U.S. We're going to have 129 million new people. Those people are going to need new homes, new workplaces, new shops, etc. And at the same time, many of our older homes, shops, workplaces are going to go out of service and will need to be replaced. So the upshot is that by 2050, over half of the built environment that we're going to have on the ground will be new. So that's both a very challenging prospect and one that invites us to do a great job of getting it right. Now, unfortunately, and Andres made the case very well, a lot of the way in which we have been shaping our built environment over the last several decades has not been on a greener, healthier path at all. As we allowed our suburban development to spread haphazardly across the countryside, at the same time as we tragically allowed our older neighborhoods, our older towns, our inner cities to be disinvested. Let's look at some of the numbers behind all the spreading out. In the 1990s, we developed land at the rate of 251 acres per hour. Over a 25-year period, we lost as much land as the states of Illinois and New Jersey combined. And by the way, the projection is by 2050 that we could lose 69 million more acres if we follow a spread out pattern of development. A lot of this development has been environmentally sensitive land, forest land, farmland, including prime farmland. We tended to settle our cities in fertile areas, so a lot of our very best cropland is right around our metropolitan areas and in the path of sprawl if we were to keep sprawling out. We can see this spatially by looking at a map of central Maryland. To get you oriented, the blue body of water here is the Chesapeake Bay. Just to the west of the bay is the city of Baltimore. Southwest of Baltimore lie the suburbs of Washington, D.C. This is what development in central Maryland looked like in the first half of the 20th century. This is what it looked like in the second half of the 20th century. Here's another way we can look at spatial development. This is metropolitan Cleveland. The red areas on the map represent the developed land within the metropolitan Cleveland region. On the left, we see 1948. On the right, we see 2002, about a half century. During that half century, Cleveland grew its metropolitan population by 27%, but it lost its central city population by 48%. Sometimes people refer to cities like Cleveland or Detroit or Buffalo as so-called shrinking cities. I don't think that's accurate. They haven't been shrinking, they've been expanding on the periphery. I prefer to say that they've been hollowing. And we can see an example of that hollowing. This is the warehouse district of Cleveland in the 1960s. And this is what that very same viewpoint looked like 40 years later. Now, as we've been doing all this spreading out, we've been doing a lot of driving. This graph is showing us the increase in driving rates, vehicle miles traveled between 1970 and 2015. The dark line is overall vehicle miles traveled. The red line is vehicle miles traveled per capita. It's sort of interesting to note that VMT per capita started slowing around 1990. And it's also interesting to see how both of them dipped during the recent Great Recession, but notice how they've also both ticked right back up. Now, driving presents one contribution to our carbon emissions, as Andres mentioned in his talk. What this graph is showing us is the distribution of U.S. carbon emissions by what the Energy Department calls the end-use sector. The U.S. is the world's second largest emitter of carbon emissions after China, but our per capita rate of carbon emissions is about 2.5 times the rate of China's. What I think is intriguing about the proportions we see in this graph is that between buildings and transportation, we have about 79% of our overall inventory of carbon emissions. Both of those can be affected by the shape and form of our built environment. Urbanism can make a difference in those two sectors of buildings and transportation. Well, while we've been doing all this driving, we haven't been taking transit very much. This is a survey of 17 nations that was published by National Geographic several years ago. We came in absolutely last in the amount of transit use that we do as Americans. We also came in absolutely last in the amount of walking that we do. The Canadians, despite their colder weather, walk significantly more than we do. The Brits walk about twice as much as we do. And the Brazilians, and they're not dancing at the world's greatest parties, walk a lot more than we do. I've got one more slide to show you the big picture data in this doozy. We discharge 10 trillion gallons of untreated stormwater from urban and suburban land into receiving waterways every year. That leads to impairment of our rivers and streams, our lakes and ponds, and our bays SUVs. So, this is my visual apology for getting us started on such a downer. But I think it's important for us to understand the context in which we consider urbanism and sustainability. And let me get to what I think is the fundamental premise. And Andres alluded to this several times during his talk. I think that when we are talking about the built environment for people, what I like to call our people habitat, we have to put people first in our thinking. I'm an environmentalist. I come from a long environmental background. I feel very strongly about environmental issues. I'm not wearing polyester, by the way. But I know that if our solutions don't work for people, they're never going to work for the planet. So we need to always have people in mind and put people first. Now let's get to the 6 strategies. I think that perhaps the most important thing we can do to advance sustainability is to guide new development to the right places. And I want to offer to you that 2 particularly right places are in the regional core and along strong transit corridors. And let me show you how we get there. The environmental profile, or as we like to say, the environmental footprint of a development or a building, is not limited to just what goes on inside that building, but it consists also of the traffic that that building generates. And what this chart is teaching us is that we use more energy and thus emit more carbon getting to and from an average office building than the average office building itself uses and emits. But where it gets really interesting is that the amount of transportation emissions associated with particular developments vary according to the location of the development. We're looking here at a carbon map of the small city in western North Carolina where I grew up. This is Asheville. Let me get you oriented a little bit. This white area that you see on the right edge of the map is the only part of the map that doesn't have any carbon data. I'm going to show you a number of maps that look something like this. The white areas don't have carbon data. In the case of this particular piece of land, that's Bisbee National Forest. That's why it doesn't have carbon data. But what we're seeing in the rest of the map are light-colored areas that have low rates of household emissions for carbon from transportation, on average. And dark-colored areas that have high rates of carbon emissions from transportation per household. Notice how the high rates tend to be on the fringe, and the lighter colored areas, the lower rates, tend to be in the regional core. The reason for this is that central locations shorten driving distances. People don't have to drive as far. They also don't have to drive as much. But statistically, the most significant reason is that they don't have to drive as far when they're located in the core. So that's Asheville, and that leads me directly to the 2 locations that I want to emphasize in this part of the talk, that development in the regional core is a good thing. By regional core, I don't mean just downtown. I mean, for most metropolitan areas, the central city and the inner suburbs, if you will. Regional core. And then the other is strong transit corridors. And here you see a reference to the research that shows that homes near strong transit generate only half the peak hour auto trips that would otherwise be predicted for their locations. And I want to illustrate this point to you by reference to 3 different locations. different parts of the country that are situated in different parts of their metropolitan regions, and as a result, have different carbon characteristics. I want to start with Chicago. Chicago's carbon map is much more complex than Asheville's, which you would expect. But Chicago is a much more complicated and a much larger city. Get you oriented, this blue area is Lake Michigan. This little dark spot right here is the Chicago Loop, the heart of Chicago's downtown. And we're looking 50, 60 some miles west to the western edge of the map. Another interesting thing to notice about this map, by the way, in addition to the fact that the lighter areas are around the regional core, is that when you get to the railroad cities outside of Chicago, such as Aurora, Elgin, and Joliet, you see that they follow their own patterns, with light-colored areas in the core and dark-colored areas around the fringe. The reason I'm starting with Chicago is I want to talk about a development called Prairie Ridge. Prairie Ridge is doing a lot of things right environmentally. You see a wind turbine in the picture behind the Ernest Young couple who apparently just happily bought a house in Prairie Ridge. They're generating renewable energy on site. That's a good thing. Homes are super energy efficient. That's another good thing. This leads the developer to claim that the homes are net zero, meaning that they use no more energy than is generated on site in the form of renewables, and thus are not net emitters of carbon. Those are great things. But look where it's located. It's 40 miles from the Chicago Loop, right smack in a dark red area. And if you look closely at the carbon data for transportation from Prairie Ridge, you see that residents of Prairie Ridge emit 4 times as much carbon as do residents of downtown Chicago, and almost twice as much carbon as do residents of the Chicago region as a whole, including all of Chicago's suburbs. Now let me show you a place that performs much better. This is Glenwood Park in Atlanta. Glenwood Park is a well-known new urbanist development that was master planned by Dover Cole. Many of us are friends with Dover Cole. They did fantastic work, as you can see from these photographs. It's lovely. Glenwood Park was built on a former industrial site about 3 miles, I think, from the heart of downtown Atlanta. Here's where it's located. The green spot is the approximate location of Glenwood Park, just east of downtown there, in the regional core. And when you look at its carbon profile, you see that it does significantly better than the regional average. It doesn't do quite as well as downtown. We wouldn't necessarily expect that, but residents of Glenwood Park emit significantly less carbon for transportation than do residents of the Atlanta region as a whole. Now let me show you our third example, another well-known development. This is in metropolitan Portland, Oregon. This is a Remco Station. A couple points to make about a Remco Station. One is when you visit there, to me at least, it feels very suburban. And that's important. I mean, first of all, it literally is suburban. But it feels suburban, which means it appeals to that portion of the market that prefers suburban living. So we need places that do that have good environmental characteristics. The second thing that is significant about Remco Station is that it's on Portland's light rail line, the Max line. Here you see location pretty far west of the regional core, right? But when you look at the carbon characteristics, you see that the Remco Station also significantly beats the regional average. Again, not as good as downtown. Don't expect that. But is better than the regional average. So these examples illustrate that if you put the development in the middle of nowhere, it's going to have bad carbon performance, no matter how good it is internally. If you put the development in the regional core, it's going to have good carbon performance. And if you put it on a strong transit corridor, it may also have good transit performance. So that's point one, get the development right. Here's point two. Make America walkable. I actually thought about doing this slide in red, with white font, white letters. Now, Jeff Speck's going to be talking about walkability later in the day, and I know he's going to knock the subject out of the park, so all I really need to do is set him up. Remember how I said that we Americans come in last at 17 Nations survey compared to others, the amount of walking we do? Well, why would we expect anybody to walk when we've been building environments in which walking is inherently unsafe and inconvenient? What I find so distressing about this particular photograph, not just that the poor woman can't get across the street, but that it looks like so much of America. Let me ask a question. How many of us, when we were kids, walked or rode a bike to school? How many of us now have kids or close family members who walk or ride a bike to school? Even in a conference of urbanists, it's a lower number, right? And nationally, the number is significantly lower. In 1969, about half of our kids walked to school. 40 years later, that number was down to 13%. But why would anybody walk to a school like this? This is a high school in Northern Virginia. Its campus is twice as big as Disneyland. The parking lots take up more space than the classrooms. And there is nothing remotely close enough, and remotely is the correct word, to walk to or from, even if someone were so inclined. Now, let me ask another question. How many of us in the audience are one way or another from the design profession? Quite a few. I know CMU attracts designers. So that leads me into the next slide, which has to do with the design of our suburban schools. This is a high school in McHenry County, Illinois, west of Chicago. I mean, honestly, there is nothing about the design of this building that says to me it's a place of learning, it's a place of nurture, it's a place of importance to its community, much less that it's walkable. I contrast that with the image and the inset of a more traditional high school in New Hampshire, when we gave those schools an architecture that indicated their importance to their communities. I wish we would get back to that. Now, I'm not going to argue that our lack of walking is the only reason why we have an epidemic of obesity in the country. But we've gone in a generation from a country in which almost no state had a significantly high obesity rate to one in which the vast majority of states are now over 25% obese. Quite a few, including Michigan, where we are over 30%. And every state is at least 20% obese. As we've gained in obesity, we have gained in weight-related disease, including type 2 diabetes. Now, Jeff will be talking about what the strategies are for making America walkable again. I want to point to one in particular. My favorite piece of research on the relationship between land use and travel behavior is a very comprehensive study that was done by Professors Reed Ewing and Robert Severo. What they did was they looked at 200 peer-reviewed studies on transportation and land use, selected 50 of those that had the best quantitative research, and then synthesized that quantitative research. One of the things that they learned is that the most significant indicator of how much walking takes place in a given community is how well connected the street network is. Andres alluded to this in his talk. When we have well-connected streets, travel distance becomes shorter, making walking more attractive. Walking routes become more direct. They also become safer. We also need walkable density. We need good infrastructure for walking. We need traffic moving at appropriate speeds. And importantly, we need things to walk to and from within walking distance. And the research shows that when all of these ingredients are present, yeah, I thought I started off with that campaign and now I've got president on my mind. When all of these ingredients are present, just put the red hat on me right now, that those residents can weigh up to 10 pounds less than residents of a driving-only subdivision, even when you tease out other factors such as age, ethnicity, and income. So, number one, get the location right. Number two, make it walkable. Here's my third point. Integrate nature into urban fabric. When we're talking about urban places, Andres made a correct reference to the fact that we cluster in cities in part to preserve the nature outside of cities. But we also need nature inside cities. But what's important is that inside cities, we need the kind of nature that fits well into urban fabric and supports urbanism and urban living. And I can think of few places that do that as well as this particular one, which is a park called Russell Square in London. It's one of my favorite parks in the world. If you know London, it's in the Bloomsbury district, steps away from the British Museum. As you can see, it is quite lovely. Here it is in the satellite view. Russell Square is 8 acres in size, which is a great size for a city park. It's large enough so that you can find a tranquil spot within, but it's small enough so that you can reach it from all sorts of surrounding places, and so that you realize you're still inside a city when you're there. If you're inside Russell Square, you realize that you're inside London in particular, because their cafes serve tea and scones. I love, love, love Russell Square. Let's go smaller. This is 1.5 acres in size. This is Elm Street Park in suburban Maryland, not too far from where I live. I'm a bicyclist and I frequently take fitness rides from my home in DC out into Maryland and come back. And sometimes I come back by Elm Street Park and take a break there. It too is quite lovely, as you can see. Here it is in its satellite view. Notice how just to the west of Elm Street Park is a busy commercial corridor. That's the main drag of Bethesda Avenue, of Bethesda, Maryland. That's Wisconsin Avenue, if you happen to know Bethesda. And then to its immediate east is a walkable neighborhood of single-family homes. Elm Street Park draws from both sides and acts as a buffer between the two. Smaller still is Elmhurst Park. Elmhurst Park is a children's park in a low-income neighborhood in inner-city Boston. The interesting thing about Elmhurst Park is that it was made from 2 vacant lots. This is in the Dorchester section of Boston. If you know the Dorchester section of Boston, it's in the Codman Square part of Dorchester. Codman Square may be low income, but it has strong community ties. It also has a new transit station. And it's getting more density. They're also getting their green space right at the same time that they're getting more density. That's the right way to do it. Bring them both in together. So Elmhurst Park was made from 2 adjoining vacant lots. I had the honor of doing some work in this neighborhood several years ago, and I was struck by how the kids had painted these signs and placed them around the perimeter. It's really a neat neighborhood in its way. Here you see the satellite view. I don't know what the fraction of an acre is, but this is an urban neighborhood where lots tend to be small, and it's about 2 lots. Parks are important, but parks are not the only way in which we should be bringing nature into our communities. We're looking here at Hartford, Connecticut. The name of the street is Capitol Avenue, running appropriately enough in the direction of the Connecticut State Capitol, which is seen there with its golden dome. Hartford has a plan, which may even be implemented by now, I would like to think that it is, to change Capitol Avenue from a street that looks like this into a street that can look like this. Notice the difference that street trees can make. Notice how at the end of the visible part of the roadway there is what looks like a park or a garden. I like to imagine that it's a rain garden because I love green infrastructure. Speaking of green infrastructure, notice how in the parking bays and crosswalks, we have not smooth asphalt or concrete, but individual pavers that allow the stormwater to seep through and filter into the ground rather than becoming polluted runoff and contaminating receiving waterways. Here's how we can green a street in a residential neighborhood. And here's how we can do it. I love these next 2 slides, even in a back alley. Bringing not only the beauty of nature, but the function of nature into our neighborhoods. There are so many ways in which we can integrate nature into urbanism. I'm not going to go through all of the ways in this picture. I do want to call out the Atlanta Beltline there in the lower left part of the slide. It's probably my favorite public works project in all of America. When we do have urban nature, the benefits are many. I'm not going to run through them all, but I do want to spend some time calling out the public health benefits, because the research literature is getting robust more so every day with respect to the relationship between urban nature and public health. When we're in urban nature, our blood pressure goes down, our mental acuity goes up. The latest research shows that we actually live longer. Those are 3 reasons why I want to spend more time in urban nature. So point 1, get the location right. Point 2, make it walkable. Point 3, integrate nature into urban fabric. Point 4, get the buildings right. Andres is correct when he says that we can't just have green buildings and think that we solved climate change and done everything that we can do as urbanists for climate change. We need to do all of these other things. But we shouldn't ignore the buildings. When 44% of our carbon emissions come from buildings, we have to think about what's going on with the buildings as well. And I like to start by talking about older buildings, because in the wonderful phrase of Carl Elefante, the greenest building is the one that's already built, because we don't have to expend the resources and energy to demolish it. As a matter of fact, the National Trust has research showing that when we demolish an older building and replace it with a newer building, even if that newer building is built to greener standards, we won't see any benefit from those greener standards for several decades because of all of the energy and resources that had to go into the demolition of the old and the construction of the new building. We can even retrofit older buildings, however, and here we see a couple of great examples. The one on the left is in Ann Arbor. That's Matt Brokoff's house. It is net zero, truly, because it's in a walkable neighborhood, as well as being internally net zero for both energy and water. Last time I checked, you could stay there. It's on Airbnb, which I think is kind of cool. The building on the right is a retrofitted green roof placed on an old building by the American Society of Landscape Architects. Jerry Green is here from ASLA. They're doing some great work in cities now. We can't rely just on older buildings, of course. Older buildings do contribute to sustainability when we're able to reuse and adapt them, but we're going to be building new buildings as well. When we build them to green standards, in particular when we build them to standards that could pass LEED Gold standards, whether or not, by the way, we actually go to the trouble to get the certification from the U.S. Green Building Council. What's important to me is just that they perform well. And when we do build these buildings that perform well, they use less energy, less water, have reduced carbon emissions, and even have lower maintenance costs. The photograph that you're seeing there is of my favorite green building in the city of Washington. It's the Embassy of Finland. Now, fifth point. This is kind of a tricky point. Employ density, but do it with sensitivity. Density is intrinsic to urbanism because it's intrinsic to cities. If we don't have urban density, we don't have a city, we have something else. So density is important. And when we do have density, we can produce significant contributions to sustainability. We can lower our carbon emissions by lowering driving rates. We can lower stormwater runoff because we don't need as much pavement. Pavement causes runoff. We don't need as much pavement per household in dense environments. And we can lower infrastructure costs. But I want to make two nuances about this. One is to examine the relationship. I want to set up one, I should say, by examining how this plots out on a graph. This is a fairly wonky graph, but I know it's familiar to some of us. What we're showing left to right is an increase in density from large lot sprawl on the left to 200 homes per acre on the right. And then you have very high driving rates at the top, and very low driving rates at the bottom. So what you see is as we add density, it's associated with reduced driving rates. But how much density do we really need to achieve those environmental benefits? It's an important question because there's a lot of fear out there that when we talk about density, we're talking about stuffing everybody in the high rises. That's not what new urbanism is about. And instead, when you ask the question, how much density do we need to realize these environmental benefits, the answer is not as much as you might think. Certainly not as much as you might fear. This is the same graph you were looking at before, but with two markers. One marker at 9 households per acre, and one marker at 53 households per acre. At 9 households per acre, you already have an association with 50% less driving than with large lots sprawl. With 53 homes per acre, you have an association with 80% less driving than you have with large lot sprawl. Here's what those two markers look like when they're done well. The photograph on top is one of Ross Chapin's pocket neighborhoods. I believe this one is in Seattle. Ross is here at the conference, I know. The image on the bottom is from the historic Beacon Hill neighborhood in Boston, 53 homes per acre. Still very human scale, still very beautiful about producing those environmental benefits. And I need to credit my colleague Susan Henderson for pointing out the density associated with Beacon Hill. Here you see those same two reference points on a graph showing the reduced stormwater runoff volume associated with various densities. So that's the first nuance I want to make about density. The second nuance I want to make is that we need to be honest with ourselves that density does bring urban intensity. And that urban intensity can include concentrated environmental impacts. On the left, we're looking at the same sort of carbon map that we looked at before, carbon emissions per household. On the right, you see that when we measured those as tailpipe emissions per acre, then some of those light-colored areas turned dark red. One of the things this says to me is that we serve our cause well when we build the right kind of density, when we build density with sensitivity, and we include places of respite as well as places of stimulation, when we include places of relief from intensity, when we include places that absorb pollution, when we build the kinds of places that people love. Now, urbanists are great at all of this stuff. You guys in the audience actually probably could talk more about how to do this than I can. But I think we serve our cause well when we're sensitive about how we do density. Speaking of places that people love, this leads directly into my last strategy, which I call sustainability is where the heart is. What I mean is that we need to aspire to maintain and create kinds of places that people love. Lovability is a mushy word. It is not easy to measure, but that does not make it unimportant, because it is the places that people love that will be cared for and sustained over time. I need to thank Steve Luzon, who's in the audience this morning, for giving us a vocabulary to talk about this really important issue. It doesn't do any good to have a building that is theoretically sustainable if in fact we don't sustain it. We throw it away in a couple of decades. So we need to create lovable places that can be sustained over time. A lovable place can be a very complex urban place. This is the Quincy Market area of Boston. It can be a very simple one. This is a small town ice cream shop, Camden, Maine. It can be a place of quietly harmonious architecture, such as we see here in Miami Beach. Or it can be a place that was literally sustained because it was loved. This is a place called Broad Branch Market. Broad Branch Market is about 2.5 miles from my house in Washington, D.C. And the owners of the market put it up for sale. Or I should say they put it up for sale when they reached retirement age. And the residents became so concerned that they might lose their prized neighborhood asset that they actually banded together to work with the seller and work with the bank in order to keep the sale open long enough so that a new buyer could be found who would maintain the market. As a matter of fact, the new buyer didn't just maintain the market, they improved it. And as you can see, Broad Branch Market is absolutely flourishing today. It's a place that was sustained because it was loved. This is the next to last slide. This is my original hometown again. This is Asheville. The building you see in the background is Asheville City Hall that was built in the 1930s. The plaza was finished in the last decade. They go extraordinarily well together, I think, that older building and that new plaza. And it's a place that's being loved. This is a lovable place. It's also a place that illustrates what I like to call the indicator species for people habitat. We learn when we study natural habitat to look to a particular species in order to indicate whether the ecosystem as a whole is likely to be healthy. So if we're studying a riparian ecosystem, a river, we may look to a particular species of fish to indicate whether the river is likely to be healthy. If we're looking at a sylvan ecosystem, the ecosystem of a forest, we may look to a particular species of bird to indicate whether that ecosystem is likely to be healthy. For people habitat, kids and elders make great indicator species. If kids and elders love a place, chances are we have a place that is lovable, that can be sustained over time, and meet the true test of sustainability. I'm going to close with a shameless plug for my book. For those of you who are interested in this concept, check it out at peoplehabitat.com. And I thank you so much for your time this morning.